Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. In today's video, we're going to be transforming this budget guitar, a Jackson JS32 Warrior, into my dream Warrior guitar. But before we get into that process, let me just mention why I'm actually doing this. So I was on the market for a Jackson Warrior because I've actually always wanted to have one, and to my surprise, there weren't a lot of options available in terms of combinations of specs and appearances. I was after some specific specs for this guitar, which include a fixed bridge, a bolt-on construction, and a 6-string format. So this 290-pound guitar was the only Warrior that had the specs that I was after. I actually made a review of this guitar, which you can check out by following the link up here. But without further ado, let's get into the transformation. Okay, so here we are in my workshop, which is definitely not my living room. And the first thing to do is to take this bad boy apart so we can start sanding and then refinishing it. So let's go. So you want to know how much of a noob I am at this kind of stuff? Well, this is my first time ever completely dismantling a guitar. Now on to the tedious process of sanding down the body. Once the finish was completely gone, I did a few iterations of wetting the wood, then sanding back again to remove raised grain. So my plan was to dye the guitar black, then sand the black back, leaving it only in the grain for some texture in the finish, and then dye it dark red. It took quite a few applications of wine red dye to get the shade of red that I wanted. In the end, the wine red dye color actually worked pretty well. Next up, we're refinishing the headstock, but first let's get those tuners off. And now it's time for a whole load more tedious sanding. The finish on the headstock was a lot thicker than the finish on the guitar body, so this took quite a bit of effort. Okay, on to the dyeing of the headstock. It was similar to the body, but it took a few more layers of the wine red dye to get the shade that I wanted here. Next up is applying finish to the body, and I chose to use True Oil for that more natural wood look. Very thin, even layers is the name of the game with True Oil, which I learned the hard way. Keep in mind that any run or patch will look exactly the same dry as it does wet. Just buffing back with steel wool in between oil coats. Not sure what it's for, but all the cool YouTube guitar builders do it. Okay, time to get started on the headstock finish while I'm waiting for the oil on the body to dry. But first, gotta scrape the binding clean. This was actually more fun than I had expected and turned out not too bad. Imperfections are only visible on close inspection. And back to more coats of oil on the body. It took several coats of oil to the back and front, I think it was about 5 or 6, but the result was better than I had expected. So here we are, a few days and countless mistakes later, and this is what we have. The last coat of finish on the body has finally dried. It was the 5th application of True Oil, and on the back it's fully black. And on the front we have this dark red with black grain, which is exactly the finish that I was going for, and I'm surprised how well it actually worked. Next up, it's time to finish the headstock, and this I'm doing with lacquer because I want the guitar to have the Jackson logo on the headstock, and so I'm going to have to use a decal, and it's not going to be easy to apply one under True Oil. So first off, I have to apply a few base layers of lacquer, and thankfully this is pretty easy since its drying time is like 15 to 30 minutes, unlike the couple of hours it takes every True Oil layer to dry. The decal also has to be sealed with lacquer prior to application, otherwise it disintegrates when submerged in water. And next up is the actual decal application. As you can see, the decal outline is visible, and making it invisible is actually a bit painful. First off, we gotta add a few more layers of lacquer on top of the decal. Then you gotta follow that with some gentle sanding of the lacquer layers on top of the decal with fine sandpaper. The idea is to sand back a bit of lacquer from on top of the decal and then apply another layer of lacquer over the whole headstock. Eventually, the depth of lacquer on top of the decal matches the depth on the rest of the headstock and the outline disappears. So now that the outline of the decal is barely visible, I'm going to add one final layer of lacquer for that shiny finish. And that turned out pretty damn well, if I do say so myself. Next up is the electronics, and we're going to start by adding some shielding to the electronics cavities.
One eternity later.
The shielding won't be any good if it's not grounded, so gotta connect all the shielded areas together and then run that to the ground. Then comes the painful process of actually wiring things up. And one tip for this bit: don't leave your guitar body unprotected. The pickups will scratch up your finish. I am almost a 100% beginner with a soldering iron, so the wiring took quite a bit of time and was a little bit frustrating at times, as I also wanted to fit a coil split. But overall, it was a success, thanks in no small part to the very detailed and user-friendly wiring diagrams available on the Seymour Duncan website. Then it was time to actually put this baby together. Oh wait, gotta make sure the pickups actually work. Alright, let's continue with assembly. Next up, gotta fit the nut. Unfortunately, I had to sacrifice a set of strings here, as I had to make sure that the nut sits at the right height before doing fretwork. I also had to make extra notches in the bridge saddles, which were not aligned with the center of the saddle, so that I could align the string with the pickup poles. Then it was time to straighten the neck and apply the all-important waifu sticker. The last thing I did before putting the whole thing completely back together was some very basic fretwork. First time I had done this, and I can't say I'm proud of my work, but it did result in lower action and much smoother frets. On the home stretch now, just a couple of final bits to go. So, after what feels like a month, and it's actually probably been more like 2, the guitar is finally done. And what can I say? It is definitely a beauty. Now, the first thing I want to just get out of the way is the fact that this was a lot more work than I expected, and rather how that work felt. It felt a lot more strenuous and draining than I expected. And that's probably mostly due to all the stuff that I had to redo, and the things that I had to redo were actually pretty much the annoying bits, but I'll get back to that later. So the whole point of this transformation was, of course, to change the looks, but even more so to change the quality of this instrument. And in that regard, I can say that it went pretty well. These pickups are absolutely great. The Seymour Duncan Nazgul, I love it. And the Sentient is pretty good in the neck as well. And with this basic fretwork job that I did, the action is actually pretty alright. I leveled the frets as best I could. It was my first time doing it. It was nowhere near a perfect job, but it means that it is a playable guitar basically. The action actually measures at 1 millimeter on the low E and 0.75 on the high E, which is not low action by any regards, but it is definitely playable. The tuning stability seems absolutely fine. Whenever I'm playing this guitar, I don't notice any change in tuning. In terms of the looks, I'm loving this finish. This definitely turned out better than I could have ever expected, I would say. But in terms of the protection of the wood of the finish, that's another story. While this finish looks great, it is not very protective of the wood, and any minor bump with anything hard will create a dent and or a scratch in the surface. And there are already a bunch of these imperfections just from me building the guitar and using it a bit. So in terms of resistance to wear, this finish is definitely not the best. The other thing about this guitar is that it feels very light, lighter than you'd expect. And just a cosmetic thing is, of course, I couldn't change anything about the neck. The binding is still the same, the fretboard is still the same, and the back of the neck is still just this plain wood, which is fine by me, but the white shark fin inlays and the white binding are not exactly matching to the rest of the guitar in terms of looks. And I was a lot more worried about this while I was putting the guitar together, but once it's together, I think it looks all right. It doesn't look too bad to me. So now that we've got that stuff out of the way, let me play a demo for you so you can hear how it sounds. So just as a final note, I wanted to go over the complications that I personally faced as a complete beginner guitar builder slash tuner while working on this project for any of you who might want to do something similar. So the first thing is the finish. The dye was pretty easy to apply. I just used a rag. It was fairly easy to smooth out and not leave any streaks. And when it dried, it smoothened out even further. And I tried to do something similar with the oil. So put some oil on my fingers and rub that as a layer of oil onto the guitar. What happened was I tried to do a similar application method where I would leave a visible layer of the oil. That was my first application. And then I let it dry and I saw some wet spots and I thought, well, those will dry out and even out. And when it was dried, those spots were still totally there. And basically, that's the first lesson learned. You cannot apply oil the same way you apply dye. You actually have to put on a very, very thin coat. So basically, it has to be completely even on application or it's not going to be even once it dries. Messing that up meant that I had to sand down the entire oil application that I made, which also sanded through the dye application, of course, which means I had to sand down the entire thing back to fully even, re-dye the entire thing, and then start my oil applications from scratch. Another issue that I faced was actually towards the end of the finish. I think it was like on my last layer of oil. I noticed that there were these tiny holes in the finish, and I don't know how that happened because those were not there when I was applying the oil. So I'm wondering if it was a piece of something that landed on the guitar and I put oil over it and then it just chipped off, and I still have no idea what that was. So next up is the wiring, and I didn't actually mess it up, and I did not expect it to be easy either, and it definitely wasn't. It was very complicated for my first time wiring, and of course I had to install a push-pull as well. But while that was difficult, I would say it actually went quite well because everything works. It was just a little bit complicated to work in that narrow space of the electronics cavity. So next up, a minor mishap. I just had the pickup out while I was doing some wiring stuff, running through some wires, and of course, complete beginner mistake. The pickups have screws and lots of sharp edges, so I just made a couple of pretty nasty scratches in the finish while doing that, which was very silly. So since we're by the pickups, the next thing that I had a complication with was the bridge. So this bridge actually came with some minor notches, not even notches, but more like marks in the very center of the saddle. And I thought, cool, let me just file exactly in those places because that's where the string is supposed to sit. So I filed some holes for the strings, and guess what? Once I placed the strings in those notches that I filed, they were completely misaligned with the pickup poles. I had to offset them, and actually quite a lot, as you can see. So going up towards the headstock, the frets, you saw I did a pretty basic fret job, I just tried to even some of the more extreme peaks in the frets, and that did allow me to get rid of a lot of the fret buzz and dead notes that were there. Now, regarding the nut actually was kind of all right. I had to file it down a little bit to get it a bit lower, and I also had to order one of these action measuring devices so that I knew exactly how low I need to get the nut. Even that wasn't as straightforward as I expected, but it was all right. It worked out in the end. And the last thing, and probably the most problematic thing of this entire build, is the headstock. First of all, removing the original finish from the headstock was a massive pain because it was a proper finish, not like the bodies. And then I went on to dyeing it, and I messed up the dyeing several times. Then I tried to finish it with oil. I tried to find out how to apply a decal, so I was finishing it with oil. Then I actually messed up my first decal because it wasn't set. I had to basically cover it with a layer of lacquer. I didn't know that, I messed it up. I ordered another 2, then I messed those 2 up. Essentially, long story short, the headstock I had to finish, I think 5 or 6 times. Basically, I was just a caveman with the sharp rock trying to do shit. And definitely not easy, a lot of frustration and a lot of work and time. But now that it's done, I can say that I am actually pleasantly surprised by how good the headstock and the body look, despite the few cosmetic imperfections that have been a result of my inexperience and negligence in some cases. I think this guitar looks, sounds, and feels pretty good. And I'm actually considering whether this should be my stage guitar because it looks unique and cool, and I'm actually very enticed to play it live. So it's time for the final verdict. Of course, I've played this guitar quite a bit. I haven't recorded anything on it and I haven't played it live, but I do have quite a good feel of how it compares to my other instruments, which are, well, obviously more expensive, but not really if you compare the cost of all the parts. And the only area that I feel like it lacks a little bit in is the weight of the entire guitar. Because it's sort of light, it feels a little bit more flimsy, a little bit more like a toy. And I'm not saying it's super light, it's just noticeably lighter than my other guitars. And just because of that, it feels a little bit more like a toy, like I'm saying. And that's really the only downside. Other than that, it plays great, and to me, it sounds great, it feels great. And I love having this shape and this look on me. You know, it feels good to be wearing this guitar, so to speak. So just holding and playing this guitar, how much would I say that it's worth? Maybe I wouldn't say that it's worth quite £1,000. If this was a mass-produced version that looked exactly like this with these specs, I'd probably place the feeling at around £800, which is a great result. But anyway, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed that. And if you're interested in my current live rig, then this is the video you want to check out next. See you in the next one.